This video will have a trigger warning for mentions of sexual abuse, self-harm, dissociation, and trauma. If you can't handle this, there will be another video recommended for you to watch above, and if you can, welcome to the rest of the video. This video was hard to start off because there's no linear timeline to give you an intro. There's no official diagnosis, there's no quantifiable proof I can offer you, but what I can tell you is that millions of people daily are living with a condition which leads them to fantasize about living a different life than the one they're currently living in. While you might say, hey, that sounds cool, I'm gonna need to stop you right there. This thing I'm about to tell you about isn't fun or cool, but we'll get into the nitty-gritties of that in today's video. But what are we talking about exactly? Maladaptive daydreaming. Before we can talk about maladaptive daydreaming, we have to address Eli Somer first. Eli Somer is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Haifa School of Social Work. He studied psychology, sociology, anthropology, clinical psychology, and counseling psychology. He specializes in dissociation, sexual abuse, and trauma. While treating patients who suffer from sexual abuse, Eli noticed that several of the abuse survivors routinely escaped into imaginary worlds so that they could enjoy personal traits and experiences missing in their real lives. Furthermore, he observed how these individuals would routinely pace or rock back and forth while daydreaming. Professor Somer coined the term to describe the phenomenon, maladaptive daydreaming. He described it as an extensive fantasy activity that replaces human interaction and/or interferes with academic, interpersonal, or vocational functioning. Eli realized that this was something more than just daydreaming. This was something that his patients were using to cope. With this, he also noticed a lot more from these articles. Let me read this out for you. T. Klinker, 1971, suggested that most fantasy life, sleeping, dreams, and waking daydreams is representation of current concerns. Nonetheless, daydreams have not been recognized as significant subjects in psychoanalytical inquiry or psychotherapy research. In seminal books, Daydreaming, Singer 1966, reported that 96% of presumably normal, fairly well-educated American adults engage in some form of daydreaming daily. This mental activity was reported to occur chiefly when one is alone, an example, in bed before sleep, and was said to focus principally on planning for future actions and review interpersonal contacts. Little data exists on the amount of normal daily daydreaming. In the context of a study of excellent hypnotic subjects, Wilson and Barber, 1981-1983, serendipitously discovered a group of avid daydreamers later characterized as fantasy-prone personalities. These individuals were said to have shared the tendency to live much of the time in a world of their own making, a world of imagery, imagination, fantasy. Wilson and Barber, 1981, page 31. Let's try to digest this all, shall we? First, we have the fact that daydreams are considered normal, to the point that we should be bringing it up in therapy, but we don't. They believed that it was a perspective into our psyche, and yet they didn't use it as a tool to, view the psyche. On top of this, there are certain people in the world who are more prone to fantasizing than other people. These people who get lost in fantasy live there. So what exactly is maladaptive daydreaming? Professor Eli Somer describes maladaptive daydreaming as states of dissociative absorption. Dissociative absorption is a tendency to become absorbed in imagination or in an external stimulus, movie or book, to the point of obliviousness to one's surroundings and reduced self-awareness. Let's touch on dissociative absorption real quick. Dissociative absorption and imaginative involvement is a tendency to become immersed in a stimulus while neglecting one's surroundings, engage in vivid imagination, confuse fantasy with reality, and act automatically. As hypothesized, dissociative absorption emerged as a unique construct, separate from ADHD and mind wandering, whereas the latter two were not completely separate from each other. Additionally, absorption was uniquely associated with OC symptoms, with a moderate to strong effect size, demonstrating incremental predictive value over the other constructs. According to Eli Somer, maladaptive daydreaming is defined as extensive fantasy activity that replaces human interaction and/or interferes with academic, interpersonal, or vocational functioning. His studies identified it as a spectrum, potentially even a variant of normal human behavior, with maladaptive daydreaming being on the pathological side of the spectrum. So maladaptive daydreaming is daydreaming, but maladaptive. It's in the name. It's something that's conductive to adaptation or will hinder you from growth. It's bad for you. It's a coping mechanism, yes, but not a good one. Similar to self-harm, it's damaging for you, just in a different way. The long-term effects of maladaptive daydreaming are anecdotal, but in my opinion, still incredibly important. It affects your relationships with everybody because you're too busy daydreaming. It affects your ability to work or go to school because you would rather spend your time daydreaming. It causes immense feelings of shame or guilt because of how much time you've spent or because you aren't actually living as your character. It's something that invades your life and it takes over. You start to daydream without even realizing it, and it slowly eats up at your time. There are these things called daydream crashes even, where when you stop daydreaming, you get heavily depressed because you're entering back into reality, and you realize that you aren't your character. There are similar characteristics from maladaptive daydreaming to those of other behavioral addictions, including an intense craving to engage in the behavior, annoyance whenever it is not feasible, and unsuccessful attempts to control, reduce, or stop it with no success. This is something that is psychologically impactful. It's different. What I want to touch on, though, is the non-negative side, because there is one. First, let's start with NeuroNarration. The term neuro-narrative refers to the intense, divergent imaginings of fantasy-prone people. These extensive daydreams are often accompanied by repetitive activity, although these daydreams/narratives are not necessarily maladaptive, and do not necessarily make it difficult for someone to live their life. An easy example of neuro-narration is reading a book. When some people read, they have the ability to actually get absorbed into the book and get lost in it mentally. It's something that a lot of people do, and the only reason why there is a word for it is because not everybody has the ability to neuro-narrate. Some people are just not fantasy-prone. They're on the complete opposite end of the spectrum and don't have the ability to imagine things in that capacity, and so that's the only reason there's a quote-unquote difference. It's the reason why some people just don't like reading. And on top of this, there's this thing called immersive daydreaming. Immersive daydreaming is similar to maladaptive daydreaming, with the difference being that they don't do it nearly as long as we do, and they have the ability to just stop whenever they want. It's common for people to immersive daydream before bed, or while they're in class, or just while they're bored. A good example of immersive daydreaming would be regular daydreams. It's a good way to start a series like a comic or fan fiction if you wanted to, because you have the ability to think up these plots and pre-plan them out in your head. It's good to keep in mind that immersive daydreamers are neuro-narrators, but not all neuro-narrators are immersive daydreamers. However, daydreaming is often confused with mind-wandering, although the two constructs differ. Mind-wandering is a regular, transient mental activity that occurs when a person's attention drifts away from the current task or external environment towards unrelated mental content. It involves internal thoughts, memories, fantasies, or unrelated topics, and may serve such cognitive functions as problem-solving and planning. Mind-wandering without noticing it is a quintessential example of a temporal dissociation, meta-awareness. The pervasive phenomenon of mind-wandering occurs when attention is decoupled from the task an individual intended it be directed toward. In many situations, mind-wandering may be quite adaptive, or at least harmless. During this state, the brain often exhibits a pattern of activity called the default mode network, also called the DMN. The DMN is the network of brain regions active when the mind is at rest and not focused on the external environment. These regions include the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and regions of the parietal lobe. In 2009, Shupak and Rosenthal presented a case study of a woman troubled by excessive daydreaming. The same patient eventually underwent a functional magnetic resonance imaging conducted by researcher Malia Mason. In a 2015 interview describing the fMRI study, Mason stated, "The test showed great activity in the ventral striatum, the part of the brain that lights up when an alcoholic is shown images of a martini. Frankly, it was super strong." Bigelson and Kelly 2015. This shows that mind-wandering differs from daydreaming, especially in terms of where the brain is lighting up and functioning. Immersive daydreaming is an absorptive form of mindful attention to generate vivid imaginary storylines. When immersive daydreaming is excessive and interferes with daily functioning and responsibility, it becomes maladaptive. During immersive and maladaptive daydreaming, the mind is not wandering off task, but instead focused on creating fanciful scenarios that can become time-consuming. These daydreams can interfere with concentrating, meeting real-life responsibilities, and maintaining relationships. There's also the unknown side of it, where a big piece of maladaptive daydreaming is the pacing and the music, but I actually want to get into that. The suggested diagnostic criteria also require at least one additional feature, such as daydreaming triggered, sustained, or intensified by music exposure, or stereotypical movements, an example, pacing, rocking, or hand movements. In addition to stereotypical movements like pacing, rocking, and mouthing, intentional exposure to specific music tracks often characterizes maladaptive daydreaming. Visual mental imagery and emotional processing during music listening are closely intertwined. In particular, the emotional tone of the music is linked to the amount and vividness of these mental experiences. Furthermore, happy music can lead to more vivid and positive daydreams, whereas sad music elicits less vivid and more negative daydreams. The evocative power of music was also observed by Herbert, who had contended that listening to music can effectively dissociate from oneself of surroundings. She argued that a common dissociative function of music is the intentional escaping of preoccupations or unwanted thoughts. All this to say, music acts as the guiding force in daydreams. It helps with world building and with setting the tone for a daydream. There's also this thing called shared daydreams, which are like role-playing sessions just with the daydream world. The reason why I call this unknown is because this article didn't come out until a couple of months ago, which means 2024. This is recent. We're about 22 years into this research and development of maladaptive daydreaming, and we're still coming up with new discoveries about it. The next topic I'd like to touch on is some of the terminology coined by and used by the maladaptive daydreaming community. The terminology is rich and expansive, but it's sourced all across the internet, Tumblr included. Many of these words have lost their original sources, likely due to the harassment they face, leading to their blogs and inevitably their original sources to be lost to time. Because of this, many people have worked to archive certain terms, and this is partially why I want to read them out to you. Just because maladaptive daydreaming is negative doesn't mean it doesn't have its own community full of culture and significance that means something to us in the community. We've connected with each other through a dark time of our lives, and we've carved out a path for us to try and dig our ways out. With that, here are some of the terms. Daydream spectrum, an umbrella term for those that are immersive and maladaptive daydreamers. Daydream crash, when a daydreamer is forced to realize that daydreams aren't real, or when daydreaming no longer has the same effect and doesn't feel as good. Daydream trigger, something that provides daydream inspiration or otherwise compulses the daydreamer to want to daydream. Daydream block, when a daydreamer is unable to daydream for a length of time. Paracosm, a detailed imaginary world. Despite it being claimed by the daydreaming community, paracosm is an actual word that technically anyone can use if they wish. Paradaptive, a paracosm that was formed to help the daydreamer cope with something. This verse, our world. Para, a daydream character. This can be an OC, a canon character, or a real person. Paras may also be referred to as OCs or characters. Maladaptive daydreaming dysphoria, a bit like body dysphoria in which the daydreamer wishes to be more like their paras. And here's a quick speedrun on the para category. There are fact paras, paras based off of a real person. Fict paras, a canon character, a para that comes from a show, game, or book. Prim paras, an original para that has no source, an OC. Parentner, when a para holds certain traits that a daydreamer may be trying to cope with. An example, a daydreamer trying to cope with trauma may have a paratraumaturner. Paran, a villain para, or a para you don't like. This may also be called a paravane because somehow it got twisted into that. Allapara, a mix of a fact and prim para. This can be a paras inspired by the daydreamer's personal interpretation or a mix of people and the original characters. Veribond, a very special type of para. The definition is vague in order to encompass a variety of experiences. A para that the daydreamer has a deep emotional connection to. A para that is on some level sentient or otherwise aware that they're a para. A para that is autonomous on some level. On top of this, there's a link between maladaptive daydreaming and dissociation that I personally don't have the knowledge to currently get into. What I can say is that maladaptive daydreaming tends to act as a gateway for many systems in multiple forms of dissociative disorders to become aware, or as I said, act as a gateway. Maladaptive daydreaming itself is inherently on the dissociative spectrum due to dissociative absorption, but also because of the way it presents itself. A private inner world in which alter personalities in DID or OSDD, or inner characters in maladaptive daydreaming, can interact with each other. A minority of people with DID have fantastic landscapes in an inner world and inner characters who do not participate in therapy, mental detachment in the form of absorption, where there is lack of awareness of events in the environment because attention is focused inward, persistent dissociation that is not limited to absorption, an example involving depersonalization or other types of dissociation, and a history of childhood emotional abuse that is common in both maladaptive daydreaming and DID/OSDD. A sense of presence of inner characters in maladaptive daydreaming which could be confused with awareness of some of the actions or thoughts of alters in DID, known as co-consciousness or co-presence. It's easy to see why you could confuse the two, and it's also to see how maladaptive daydreaming acts as a gateway for the other. You may confuse the two. You may genuinely have OSDD and then tell yourself it's just daydreaming when it's not. The two are so similar. Maladaptive daydreaming can also affect the identity. Certain people who maladaptive daydream can identify as this thing called malagender or malosexual, which is where your sexuality or your gender is different in a daydream than it is in reality. Malosexual is a term where one's orientation is influenced by one's maladaptive daydreaming or another similar condition. For example, a malosexual individual might feel pansexual normally, but may feel asexual when maladaptive daydreaming. Malosexual can be an orientation on its own, or it can be combined with other terms. For example, a malabisexual individual is someone who is only bisexual when they're daydreaming or in their daydreams. Malagender is a gender that is influenced by one's maladaptive daydreaming, or another similar condition. For example, a malagender person might be a gender normally, but may feel like a demi-boy when maladaptive daydreaming. Malagender can be a gender on its own, or it can be combined with other terms similar to malosexual. In reality, I'm asexual and aromantic. I've had relationships in the past, but it wasn't until I personally had a partner in my daydream that I ever felt love for the first time. Real love, where you get butterflies and sort of sickly sweet feeling where you get the warm fuzzies. I felt love, but I was never in love before that point, and it really made me question my identity as an aro ace. I wanted to engage in all these actions in my daydreams that I would never do in reality, and it makes you start to question yourself and your identity. Imagine you daydream as a man 24/7 when you identify as a woman, and how that could begin to make you question things about yourself. You can see why we want it to be considered its own disorder. For some reason, there is a lot of people trying to discredit maladaptive daydreaming because they say that Eli Somer is looking for a false positive. They say that because he studies trauma, he's seeing things that aren't actually there, that he's seeing false positives. They believe that correlation is not causation in this case, and for some reason, they believe that Eli studying psychology and trauma means that it discredits him in terms of maladaptive daydreaming, when I, on the other hand, believe that it means the opposite. It means he has studied in the field and he knows what he's talking about. We want to be able to seek treatment for what we're going through, but there's currently nothing in place for those of us who daydream in this manner. It's not considered bad enough for us to seek any help, and they expect us to be the ones to bring it to light. We started to educate ourselves on the existence, and we are talking about it, and I'm hoping this video can continue to raise awareness on maladaptive daydreaming. We've come so far as a community, and I can only hope that we continue to grow. The community is the biggest on Tumblr, where there's just such an expansive community, and there is a lot of drama, but that's Tumblr for you. With all that being said, if you liked the video, please do so, and leave a comment if that's what you're interested in doing. Subscribe and hit the bell notification, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys. Something I do want to address is that I don't know where Eli Somer stands. It's not my place to speak on this because I stand with Palestine. I will also be putting a bunch of links down below to help support and education on what's happening in Palestine because it needs to be talked about. I don't have a big platform, but I do want to talk about it. What's happening is a genocide. There's so much you can do to help what's happening. And the reason why I bring this up is because there are people talking about whether or not Eli Somer stands with the IDF. I do not believe he does. It's not my place to say. I don't speak for him, obviously. And he's written articles talking about Palestine, so he recognizes it as a state, as its own being. And so I don't know where to stand on that. I just want to say I do not support him in any way. I'm just here using his research, if that makes sense. There's a lot of research that he has provided, and to just haul it all out would make no sense. And with that, that'll be the end of the video. Free Palestine.